Bull Flaherty, welcome to the podcast.
Peter, thanks for having me. So it's always a pleasure to speak to you and talk to you, and especially about everything that's going on in these rapidly changing energy markets.
Absolutely. And it was cool because you're one of the few guests that I got to sit down with in person. It was a few months back in Houston. And I loved meeting you and your team. And I walked away from that meeting thinking these guys are experts in battery storage. So I'd love to hear sort of your background, how you guys came together as a group and what you guys are up to now.
Absolutely, Peter, and thank you for the compliment. And we definitively try in the space, and have obviously been involved for a good number of years. All of us came from trading backgrounds, uh, various and across. We had people work for Enron, Duke, Talon, Direct, EDF, EDP, and all of us had been working together, all kind of came together at one firm, and we built kind of a 12 gigawatt portfolio of solar and storage there, kind of starting in a 2019 timeframe. And, it had come time that, obviously for that particular company that we were at, we should have gotten some equity or gotten some skin in the game. That didn't happen. So we decided to go out and hang our own shingle, so to speak, and essentially go out there and create battery storage projects. And so it's been very, very involved. We've set up our team to essentially, do all of the basics and block and tackle so that we can model on a sub-hourly basis, look at our forward curves and look at realistic, I'll say what we refer to as market curves as opposed to merchant curves, and be very, very fine-tuned with our placement of storage and be very aware of the different generation assets that are co-located around them so that we have, kind of an excellent view on congestion curtailment and basis. We're doing this primarily in ERCOT, but we have developed in PJM, WEC, and Cal ISO as well.
Very cool. So market curves versus merchant curves. I bet there's a lot to unpack there. Tell me what you mean by that.
So what we've seen for a lot of the financial world when they come in and actually try to finance these projects is that they'll come to an independent engineering firm and essentially purchase a linear curve. And that linear curve is kind of forecast forward and it goes straight up. And as you know, and as you've seen in the market, and I'm sure all of your listeners would agree, nothing's ever linear. And so essentially, we essentially pair that on a forward basis with a lot of the actual forward contracts that are trading on CME, NYMEX, and ICE. And so it kind of gives us a good insight into the movement of the overall market as it goes forward. And obviously that is not linear. And you can forecast for, let's call it your first 2 to 5 years and be fairly confident in that forecast. Once you get past 5 years, it's a bit of a gamble, a bit of a crapshoot, but you can't extrapolate those curves out to at least term. A lot of the financial institutions want you to extrapolate those out to actually life of the actual project. And, we feel that we can come close on that barring, kind of your Six Sigma events or your other things that are really unforeseen that really kind of move pricing up or down in a dramatic way. But we feel it's a much more realistic way to look at the market. I think that overall, this has kind of affected a number of solar projects that have been out there in that they're too optimistic on their production profiles and they've used too optimistic of a curve. And so that once they get into a true market situation, there's a tendency to underperform, excuse me, from an ROI standpoint.
Sure. And investors hate underperformance, that's for sure. And so what is driving all these battery storage projects to get built in ERCOT? We're hearing about it as investment bankers and now glad to be talking to somebody who's an expert. What do you think is driving it?
Well, I would say that, from a theoretical standpoint or a market standpoint, there's this thought process called congestion persistence theory that's out there. And essentially, what that states or what that kind of means is anytime you have a given RTO ISO geography or area where more than 30% of your generation stack is intermittent, you're going to have high congestion problems and you're not going to be able to pair the power with your peak load times. And so it's going to change the overall shape of the generation profile. And that power will need to be moved to your essentially your peak periods via storage. And so that has really driven a great deal of that and just the natural production of your intermittence. So if we take wind, the wind has a tendency, especially in the US, to start blowing in the middle of the night and it will, essentially produce or blow until, mid next day until early afternoon and then it tails off. And so if you take that shape or that production profile and layer it over your typical or your historic curve, which starts at 6 or 7 in the morning when people get up and go to work, peaks in the afternoon, and then tails off into the evening. You've got obviously your afternoon and evening periods when that peak comes, where wind is not playing a role there. Then if you overlay your solar profile, which starts when the sun comes up and when the sun goes down, it starts to change that curve. And, we see between generation and load pairing that it creates, what's called the duck curve. And that duck curve was seen in Cal ISO. We've seen it in ERCOT as well, where you have a peak in the morning. And then as the solar fades off in the afternoon, you've got a heavy peak in the evening. And so we've seen a 4-hour peak that's lasted in California and a fairly consistent 2-hour peak that's basically been in ERCOT. And so we need the storage assets to come in and essentially move that power from the middle of the night to those peak periods. And that's really pushed it. And frankly, there are a number of issues that come out to expand that. I think the majority of batteries, if we take a look over the last, let's call it 2.5 years from the expansion, the majority of batteries prior to a year ago were 1 hour in nature and were mostly nodal arbitrage. That expanded to 2 hours so they could try and essentially take advantage of ancillary services. But that is rapidly changing. And it seems from quarter to quarter, there's either new regulatory that comes in or new incentives that come in to expand that amount of storage that's out there from a duration perspective. And right now that's moving to almost 4 hours.
Wow. So I imagine going from 1 hour to 4 hours, it's going to create a shift in the winners and losers in technology. What are some of the technology, the batteries that are out there that are winning in this market?
Well, and let me unpack that as well, because just before I jump into the technology portion, one thing that has garnered a great deal of attention over the last, let's call it 2 months, has been this proposed protocol for ERCOT, and it's NPRR 1186. Essentially, ancillary services, and this is your frequency regulation to make sure that overall the transmission lines are still pushing at 60 megahertz, reg up and reg down. So in your morning when you're ramping up or in the evening when you're ramping down, having to add additional power out there that's outside of peak, as well as standby or emergency power that would come in if something trips offline or if there's a spike in load during the day and you have to answer that period. These ancillary services in ERCOT have always been for a 4-hour bid time. And so if I'm going to bid into those markets, I have to provide 4 hours of power. And so if I have, and just to use easy numbers, if I have a 10 megawatt 1 hour battery and I'm bidding in for essentially 4 hours worth, I can only discharge 15 minutes per hour over that 4-hour period. And frankly, as far as that's concerned, your first hour is typically or historically your most valuable or your most profitable hour, given that's when the peak first hits. And they start to bring on resources over the course of that 4-hour period. And so you can't necessarily operate a lithium ion or a lithium iron battery in that manner, because if you're discharging a little bit over a period of time and you're going full discharge for that period as opposed to just 80%, it can accelerate your degradation curves. And so what we had seen a lot of the players doing was essentially they were discharging 80% of their battery into the first hour so they could capture that profit for the first hour. And then they would settle hours 2, 3, and 4 with power they had purchased in the day ahead market. And essentially, it kind of confounds the regulators and makes them angry from a standpoint that it's not truly additional power because it's already included in the stack. And so they were narrowing for those hours when they were doing it. And, you know, I think the regulators viewed it as cheating. Now, I'm an Astros fan, and so I'm a firm believer that if you're not cheating, you're not trying. And so I don't give them any judgments on that side. However, you do have to solve for additionality. So, what this Protocol 1186 is putting forward is that any battery that bids in the ancillary service markets, one, will have to provide 4 hours of power, and two, will have to report their state of charge for every hour they're in those markets. So if I release 80% of my battery in that first hour and I bid the entire amount over the 4 hour period every hour, then I would have to recharge my battery in order to bid into that second hour. And I have to recharge the battery for the third hour. And so that makes that a very dicey proposition because if I'm recharging in a peak, I'm paying a high price for that power to come in. And so there's a good opportunity that I may not make any monies in make any money in hour 2, 3, or 4. And I may be eating into my profit from hour 1 if that's the case. So there's a number of people that have pushed back against it. And obviously this is pushed for more duration in the overall market. And so it's been very clear that they're requiring 4 hours now, but they reserve the right in the very near future to move it to 6 hours worth of biddable power for that period of time. And so that being said, your current ubiquitous batteries out there in terms of overall technology or chemistry are lithium ion and lithium iron. And their overall degradation profiles don't lend to being tapped on a consistent basis. It's more you charge it up and you charge it up for 100%, and then you discharge it to 80%, and then you move to the next cycle. And so a lot of alternative chemistries have come on the market. Nickel has been one, nickel titanate, nickel cadmium that we haven't seen grow because their degradation curve, they haven't seemed to have gotten around a lot of the issues that we've seen over a long-term basis uh, for quick degradation. We've seen some very promising things out of zinc bromide. We've seen some very promising things out of iron air batteries and also flow batteries. But I think right now, zinc bromide, that chemistry is the only one with real capacity to deliver in the current market. And there's been broader amounts of using battery, everything from using actual water where they're moving it to run a turbine for a period of time, and you're moving it from, point A to point B, to power water turbines. We've seen it done with compressed air as well, where you've got solar and wind to run a compressor, and you release that under pressure over time to run a turbine as well. And we've even seen some very novel things in terms of using salt pillars and solar concentrators that would heat the salt pillar up to 1200 degrees. And once that's heated for 1200 degrees, it takes 9 hours to cool down. And so if you have the water availability, you can create steam and run turbines off of that. And that would extend past your solar, your diurnal shape hours in order to give you storage. And I think that would match on a 3 to 4 hour basis. I think once it gets beyond that, it cools down enough where you're going to be compromised on making steam. But there's a number of different things that are out there. And frankly, I think there's a lot of technology that is yet to be unveiled that's going to essentially address this longer duration that people are looking for.
Wow. Yeah. So devil is in the details would be my summary when it comes to the technology. I'm curious based on what you guys are seeing in the market. I know you guys are looking at a number of projects. Without saying anything to reveal any secrets, I'd love to know where you guys are seeing opportunities within the overall ERCOT market and then maybe within some other markets.
So we're seeing markets, and this is kind of following along with the transmission upgrades as well. I would say that first and foremost, you have number of opportunities with solar and wind in ERCOT West, given the fact that there is so much congestion and curtailment and basis risk that's been done there especially during peak hours during the day. And if we're moving, and what we've seen recently out of California is that the duck curve has moved to a canyon curve where we have kind of a morning peak and they actually go negative for net load during the day because of all the solar that's out there in terms of their generation stack. And then they have a large climb into the evening as that solar starts to tail off. We have not seen that in ERCOT. And I think part of the reason we haven't seen it in ERCOT is just the heat and the high HVAC loads that come online in Texas for the majority of the year. And so it's more of a we've seen more of an exaggerated duck curve with kind of a double peak in the afternoon when it's hottest or the heat's most during the day. And so from that cooling standpoint, there's a lot of load that comes from that. And so, to answer your question directly, we're seeing opportunity obviously a lot around a lot of urban areas. And, this is one thing that we've seen in ERCOT and we're seeing it in some areas of the other country or other parts of the country. But the load growth for uh, ERCOT's grown from a demand standpoint at 7% year over year for the last 2 years. And the estimates that we're seeing right now, if you include EVs into the mix and overall turning of the fleet, if you will, of personally owned vehicles and commercial vehicles that are out there over the next 30 years, that at least for the next 20 years, there is a consistent 4% growth in electric demand across the United States. Now, we haven't seen that EV growth in Texas yet. And frankly, there's some areas of the state that are actually growing at 8% on a year-over-year basis. And with that 20 to 30% stack of intermittence, it requires storage to smooth those out over time. And so there's been a lot of talk that, essentially once you get to, let's call it 10 to 12 gigawatts worth of storage in Texas, that it would be saturated. Now, I think by end of 25, and some say it's coming even earlier than that it's coming in at 24. But by end of 25, we should be roughly at 14 gigawatts worth of storage. At least that's what's paid for in terms of interconnection right now in ERCOT, that we would be saturated. But given the amount of intermittence and whether or not transmission can keep up with that, those storage opportunities are coming mostly in your highly congested areas. So just to answer your question straight out in a very long-winded fashion, if we just followed the general transmission constraints, which would be Panhandle to north to Houston, and west towards north and Houston, those are the easiest areas where storage could play a huge part.
No, that's really helpful. Now, you mentioned interconnect and always that I can imagine is a challenge. What does the interconnect process look like? And if developers aren't already in it, are they kind of out of luck at this point? Or is there room for people to get in the queue and still get some projects built?
There's room in the queue. The one thing about ERCOT is that it's always a rolling process in terms of interconnection overall. And obviously there's a lot that's out there. But we've seen a lot that have roiled that overall. We've got projects with interconnection that for whatever reason they've failed to get financing, or they've had, in the solar case, some issue with panels or some issue with the overall turbine towers for on the wind side. And even for storage in terms of battery delivery, we have seen some issues where, both battery delivery as well as financing. And, believe it or not, a huge choke point for the entirety of the stack has been the availability of transformers, especially on the 345 to 34.5 standpoint. That has not had a great deal of availability, one. And two, the lead times there, we saw it at one point in time for transformers as well as breakers was up to almost 18 to 20 months. And so I think that's been the biggest kind of choke point overall is equipment availability. Now I think that we're coming up the curve on that and hopefully we'll be able to sate those. But to answer your question directly, if you're ready, almost the way PJM's adopting their first ready, first served process going forward, it's kind of always been that way at ERCOT and it's fairly streamlined. So if you're willing to put up the money and essentially are ready to go, the TDSPs will respond. I think the other thing that would be kind of a backlog or a encumbrance would be the fact that a lot of your TDSPs are understaffed. And so from that standpoint, they've had a difficult time in dealing with all the requests. But that being the case, I'd say that right now, if you were looking to get interconnection in ERCOT, you're looking at probably an 8 to 9 month process.
Gotcha. And you mentioned, I think you mentioned potentially co-locating with existing wind and solar assets. If you go that route, you still have the same interconnection challenges. Does it make it easier? What are some of the benefits to that model?
Well, then it becomes a question of transmission. And that's really where a lot of your analytics will come in from an hourly basis. From a standpoint, there's normally, especially now, and one thing on the technology side that I don't think we really discussed was energy density. And so, obviously lithium ion, lithium iron has been at roughly a megawatt in terms of a 10 by 20 can. So they could put anywhere from, let's call it 800 kilowatts to 1.2 megawatts in a given footprint. I would also, say that we've seen sodium ion batteries. Now, I have not seen this. CATL has a sodium ion battery, and I think their product name on it is Prussian Blue. They're claiming that they're at 3.2 to 4.2 megawatts per can, which is a tremendous energy density. So the footprints have been shrinking overall. And from a standpoint, if I have an extra 30 acres at a wind site or at a solar site with an existing substation that I could expand, because obviously you'll need to expand in terms of breakers on that side. But if I can do that, the only gating item there is transmission. And so you bring your analytics in on an hourly basis. I find out when the most congested hours are, or, in some cases, as we've seen in ERCOT West, there are 0 and negative hours. And so I find out when those hours are, you charge the battery during those periods and then release them into the evening peak. And it works extremely well with solar. And frankly, back to the tech question, if you've got a battery and you've got a technology or a chemistry that can be tapped consistently, it can be charged, discharged, and it doesn't affect the degradation curve, that does extremely well with wind because you're consistently all that time, you're charging up and you may be doing it over periods of time, but that works extremely well if you can essentially cycle that battery harder than you would say a lithium ion battery. And so let me just kind of close out on that and say that, the co-location side of things can really help profitability overall. And with the current ITC that's out there, you can do so at a very subsidized rate because we're seeing ITCs in Texas on average, given the fact that there's so much fossil fuel work in the state, that you're seeing ITCs normally along lines of 40%.
Wow. Yeah. So it's very attractive. I'd say the market sounds good. It looks like there's a little bit of runway. You've got room in the interconnection queues. You've got some advancements in technology, a lot of positives, a lot of tailwinds. When it comes to finance and getting these projects paid for and built, what do you think are some of the, let's say, misconceptions or challenges for developers in bringing in capital to get these projects built?
For battery storage, the most common and the most difficult one is finding a financier on the construction and term loan side that will allow you to operate your battery as merchant and not have a power purchase agreement or offtake agreement with it. Now, there've been a few that I've seen that come through that have been 100% merchant. I think that is becoming more ubiquitous. I think financial institutions and banks are becoming more comfortable with it overall, but the majority that I've seen have come through have had some portion that has been fixed for the period of construction and term loan that kind of match tenor on that side for an offtake agreement. And of course, the worst part about that is that, you leave money on the table there. I mean, obviously, you're giving your upside to your counterparty if you've got a kind of fixed price on that. But there have been some interesting structures that have been put through on a few of those PPAs that we've seen, especially on the VPPA side, where they've kind of tried to put a variable structure in. But offtake has been one of the biggest issues on that financing side. And then, of course, just the general issues we've been seeing around the banks for, let's call it the last quarter or so, given the fact that we are in this interest rate environment that's they're rising so rapidly, and their need to increase deposits to kind of offset their lower reserves that they have out at lower interest rates. That's also been an issue, but that's one that's just recently popped up. But I would say that overall, you've got issues with batteries being merchant, which is how you want to run them, because essentially, if you can't merchant your battery, it's difficult to optimize. And then two, this kind of classification of tier one batteries. So I would say that before mid-year this year, or prior to mid-year this year, the majority of the batteries that were getting funded were only tier one, and that was a handful of companies that were out there. And so obviously their capacities have been maxed out. And so now, as we moved into the second half of this year, we've seen kind of some of your tier two batteries and some of your lesser known batteries start to get funding. And so that's been very key, very a big positive in terms of moving the industry forward. And just recently as well, we've seen US manufacturers of batteries start to enter the market. And so all of that bodes well for supply and capacity moving forward, especially in the US, because it just means, more jobs and keeping more money at home, so to speak. But those issues have affected financing. And I think those are probably the biggest ones that we've seen so far. Now, the one thing that we really haven't seen move through the market in a broad manner is this new fungibility of ITCs, that I don't necessarily have to have a tax equity partner, but that I can sell that ITC to a given party and through milestones essentially have that liquidity there as equity to get that project done. And so we've just started to see that move through, I'd say in the last quarter or two, given the fact that the IRS has put better guidelines around it over the last year as to how those will be interpreted, that we've seen people move forward. And I think it's going to be a big factor for the first part of next year.
Yeah, that's really a great overview that you've got there. When I think about getting these deals funded, it's easy to think about greenfield or building new projects. Are you seeing anything in terms of M&A or projects that come up that are for sale, where uh, somebody can come in and acquire existing assets?
Now, for existing assets, we see it on the wind side, that obviously there are wind farms that are out there. And frankly, I think one of the most profitable producing assets you can pick up from a renewable standpoint is essentially wind turbines that are, roughly, let's call it 10 to 15 years old, that have come off of their PPAs. And so frankly, those assets are free, and essentially, you know, when I say they're free, they're unencumbered by a power purchase agreement. And frankly, if you can acquire those assets, they're extremely profitable. And if you can enhance them with storage, you can optimize them in ways we haven't seen. And so I think there's a tremendous opportunity there. Most of the solar that is out there is not off of their PPAs. And so they're still in that structure. We have seen some portfolios that have been flipped, but for the most part, you know, the big, and sorry about that, the big push has been in coal retirements and in natural gas retirements. And so you've got these large interconnections that are there and available. And, you know, I don't know if we necessarily want to get into this portion of it because it's kind of outside battery storage. But given the price of natural gas, we're swimming in natural gas in the United States. And so we've seen pricing that has been challenged. I mean, frankly, if we look out on a forward curve for the next 2 years, it's very difficult to find a five handle at any point in time in the next 24 months. And technology has moved up that if you're deploying new gas technologies at these places and you're fully scrubbing the overall facility and you're at the new ones are coming out at a heat rate of roughly 6.2. They're extremely efficient and, they emit much less than their predecessors. And we've even seen on the Houston Ship Channel in ERCOT, the deployment of an alum cycle plant that rather than use steam as its combined cycle, uses heated CO2. And it is truly a net zero plant because it captures all of the carbon dioxide and heats that carbon dioxide to run its reciprocal turbines. And then it captures that CO2. And that CO2 can either be sequestered or it can be used as a profit stream and either sold to the oil and gas or chem industries on that side for pressurization. So it's still going downhole. So it ends up that you have a combined cycle gas turbine facility, obviously using CO2, that is truly a net zero plant. And that's extremely interesting when you pair that with carbon sequestration. But I mean, a lot of new technologies are coming along the line. And so, you know, I know that we've kind of taken a look at the next 20 to 25 years as being a broad deployment of wind and solar. But over the next 5 years, I'm very anxious to see the amount of technology that comes out in existing and new facilities for generation that I think that may even speed us towards that net zero or, in this case, that 1.5 degree kind of stall point much sooner than we expected.
You're a technology optimist, as am I. And it is amazing to see what's happening, and you got to give hats off to the ERCOT market for being almost like a little mini laboratory. So it seems like there's a lot of innovation happening there. But what are some other markets that you guys are taking a look at where you see opportunity?
Tremendous markets in WEC. And honestly, the DOE just came out yesterday, or should I say over the weekend, and talked about transmission upgrades. And when you talk about a national grid, a truly national grid with, let's say, you know, 500 kV lines that are truly carrying power between RTOs and ISOs, so there's interconnects between the actual geographic regions, and actually being able to share and wield that power, that's extremely exciting. And so, we've seen it in the Southwest. I believe Orsted's building a 4.2 gigawatt wind farm that is going to connect from essentially northeastern New Mexico down to essentially Scottsdale, Arizona. And that's going to have a 500 kV carry line that will be going essentially 500 to 600 miles to kind of bring it to that main branch where, you could theoretically produce wind and solar power in New Mexico and Arizona and carry that into LA or Long Beach. That's very interesting. I think it's a very prospective area in terms of the Southwest. In terms of the, kind of Northwest, you've got Wyoming, and Wyoming traditionally has pulled 40% of their state revenue from coal taxes and taxes on coal mining, which is obviously in decline. But Wyoming is a net exporter of power into Montana and Idaho. And given the outflux from California into those states, they're looking at putting more renewables to work to export that power and essentially tariff it as it goes out. And so that looks extremely interesting up in Wyoming. And then there's opportunities in Illinois and in MISO. Overall, MISO has had a lot of wind, but they have not been able to essentially move it around. And so if we can get with this transmission, there's a tremendous amount of opportunity from storage and moving that out of the actual kind of wind centers, more towards your populated areas, your rural areas, moving towards, the middle of the country, especially in that kind of, let's call it Minneapolis, St. Paul to Chicago area where there's very dense populations overall and moving it there. And then, frankly, as far as the Eastern Interconnect's concerned, New York has signed some of the most advantageous state incentives to go along with your federal incentives to deploy storage there. So, I mean, there it's rife overall. Massachusetts has come out and essentially said that they would like to deploy up to 6 gigawatts of storage. And, as we get more dense and we have smaller footprints and more safety with the overall storage, I think it's going to be very ubiquitous in those highly populated areas. So, I would say that there is a tremendous amount of opportunity to expand in a number of different areas. Obviously, Texas right now is number one in wind and solar with ERCOT. California is in second in terms of solar. I think California is number one in storage right now, but ERCOT's quickly catching up. And I think those will serve as your beta labs for how it's going to be deployed for the rest of the country. But if we can truly get a overlay of national transmission where we're moving between the ISOs and the RTA or RTOs and essentially moving that power and being able to market that power at a price, then I think that it it kind of dictates where your storage is going to be placed. One thing that I haven't mentioned, and frankly, it's because they've had some problems, is offshore wind and your offshore wind farms. And frankly, where those interconnects come on shore is a natural place for storage because with that wind blowing all the time, you could put a large amount of batteries there and basically have that ready for your peaks. And given the dense populations along the coast, would serve those communities extremely well.
Wow. Yeah. So, of course, offshore wind has taken a little bit of, heat. It's always been a challenge, but I know that down in the Gulf of Mexico, they've been talking about doing it for quite some time. And hopefully that will become a new opportunity. Bull, you gave us a really great overview of the markets. I'd love to maybe talk a little about your team. You mentioned you have 7 folks on the team there, and that's up from the first time we met. What does it take in terms of skill sets to build a team of developers? And how would you characterize your team?
Historically, people who are good at math. Yeah, that has been the one driving force. People that are good at math, people that are good at analytics and numbers, and but frankly, what obviously with this whole kind of technology run, you used to have either a master's or a PhD that would be doing and operating your transmission reports and how that power was going to be wielded from a physical and a financial basis from wherever your generation node was. The amount of transmission software and let me come back and say not transmission software, but production simulation software that has come up the curve. They've put algorithms to work. They've put a number of kind of bells and whistles in that speak to specifics, whether I'm using it to manufacture widgets or whether I'm using it to produce power in a specific geography. They've really tailor made a lot of it to specific use case. And it's made it easier to have someone come in and granted, they need to have a background in power or electrical engineering to kind of do it. But and that just comes with a knowledge base in terms of what they're doing, in terms of your overall ohmic loss over lines and carry and that type of thing. But they've made it much easier that it's more ubiquitous. And so, the guy who heads up transmission for us, he's a PhD. He's worked in every RTO ISO in the US, as well as some foreign grids as well. And so, we're blessed to have him with us. And so, we've got the talent to do it here. But I think that the overall industry overall is moving towards a more technology and I don't want to say AI centric because that's so overused. I don't know how you feel about that overall. Uh, but definitively, I think AI has been overused, and so I don't think it's there yet. But it's definitely easier overall to use it with that technology. So, between having 7 people that average, say, somewhere between 20 and 25 years worth of experience in the overall general power and energy markets, it has been great for us and allowed us to kind of go through and do everything from, sub-hourly modeling, which I don't think a lot of people do, uh, to, essentially going through weather patterns and setting up if we're looking at solar from a standpoint, getting a particular kind of historic albedo for a given geography to set up those power production profiles and those 8760s and those diurnal shapes. And the one thing, trading experience, market experience, commercial experience, that has kind of I think that's brought us all together from a standpoint of taking all of those analytics and all of that information and being able to put it into a, very competitive, overall market where one needs to be nimble in order to make money if you're not going to have a PPA on it. And being able to make money in that, I think that those have been the key factors in terms of putting our team together overall is being able to be commercial and being able to monetize it. Um, because obviously we do a lot of rabbit hole thinking on that side in terms of going down and going down different routes that I think people wouldn't normally go through. But yeah, I think the commercialization side is always omnipresent, no matter what we're doing on that side. And I don't know if you see that in other developers or not, but
I'll say that's exactly what we look for when it comes to whatever industry it is, the sub industries within the broader energy sector, whether it's hydrogen, whether it's materials, whether it's power, whether it's energy storage, is that commercial capability, the intellectual horsepower, and the proven ability to execute. So I think you guys certainly have that within your team. Man, Bull, I wish we could talk longer. We're already at time here. Why don't you tell the audience how they can get in touch with you? I know you're on LinkedIn, both Flaherty and Elegant Power. If I'm saying that right, I'm sure folks will want to be in touch.
yeah, absolutely. You can reach us through our website, www.allegiuspower.com. There's a link there for info@allegiuspower.com. We've got somebody that monitors that all the time. And I'm out on LinkedIn as well as the entire Allegis crew. And so please feel free to reach out. We're here to help and hopefully drive this brave new energy economy.
All right. So I got to pronounce it right. Allegis Power. I'm going to blame my partner for pronouncing it wrong, but
We are yours. Allegis is the US version. Elegis would be the European version.
oh, the European version. Okay.
So if we were in Sweden, you would have been perfect.
All right. So that's awesome. I'll take it. I like Europe. I haven't been there in a while, but I hope to get back ASAP. But this has been Bull Flattery on Energy Superheroes. Allegis Power or Elegis if you're in Europe, and they are a really strong developer of energy storage assets. Bull, thanks for being on.
Peter, thank you so much for having me and have a great day.